and welcome to Weird Together. I'm Brendan Storr, host of the Ghost Story Guys podcast.
I'm Joseph Kamal, host of The Cardinal Rule.
And this is the show where we celebrate the latest and greatest in independent horror films. We're not critics.
We're not experts.
We're just weird together. Joseph, my friend, how are you doing?
I am well. It's middle of the summer. I went out of town to Greenville, South Carolina a couple weekends ago. Had a great time. I think of it as like there's Austin, Texas is that cool, funky, weird city. And then Asheville, North Carolina is kind of that next tier that's kind of Austin light. And Greenville's kind of a step, kind of that next tier of smaller, but kind of up and coming. It's got some cool restaurants and shops. Went saw Shrek the musical at their local play, which was fun. It was a local production, well done. So, I'm enjoying the summer or having, had a good vacation and, kind of getting ready for the semester. So, Brent, how are you, sir?
I'm good. Generally speaking, I had a great day. My wife took me for lunch at a restaurant that I hadn't been to yet. I had halloumi fries, which I'm sad to say I'd never had halloumi before. It's for those of you who don't know, I was like coming to this. It's a kind of cheese. So basically, these are like fancy matzo sticks. They were very fancy and they were very good. And this helped ease the sting somewhat because I made a bit of an ass of myself, Joseph, which I'm sure will shock you. I went to go see the film Asteroid City the other night, which I really loved. And on the way home, it was after midnight. The streets were empty, so I was just talking to myself. And in that way that you do when you don't think you're being observed, you get a little bit into it. You start making facial expressions. You start moving your hands a little bit because you're doing both sides of the conversation. And then I realized there was a young woman running towards me, presumably to catch a bus, and she had very clearly seen me do this. And so instead of just rolling with it and owning it, I tried to pretend like, oh, I'm looking at my phone. And she had this grin as she ran past me because we both realized I was not looking at my phone. She just caught me talking to myself like an idiot. So that was humbling. And the cheese fries, they helped ease the pain somewhat.
Nice. Well, hey, real quick, let's say, hey, we've got Rin, as always, hanging out with us. Good evening, dear sirs.
Hey, Rin.
Appreciate it. And we've got Derek as well. Evening, gentlemen. Thank you
Evening,
both for hanging out with us during our Weird Together live stream. So what we got going today, Bren?
Well, Joseph, on this episode, we are talking about the latest film from director Ted Geoghegan, Brooklyn 45. And Brooklyn 45 is set in 1945, stars Larry Fessenden, Jeremy Holt, Anne Ramsey, Ron Raines, Ezra Buzzington, and Christina Klebe. And it's about a lot of things. It's about grief. It's about war. But in the broad strokes, it's about a seance that goes very wrong, and about a party that I think it's a party we've all been to. If you're the character of Bob, who is the date, everyone else knew each other and worked together during the war on the Allied side. Bob is a government clerk. And if you've ever been to a party with your respective other, your partner, your significant other who works somewhere and they're with their work friends and you don't know a single goddamn thing about what's going on, that is very much the vibe of Brooklyn 45. And of course, there's a lot to talk about with this movie, given the subject matter and some stuff that we learned afterwards. But before we talk about the film itself, Joseph, you never go into the movies alone. You bring every other film, what's going on in your day, every other experience with you. And so that's why before we talk about any film on the show, we have to take apart the baggage. All right, Joseph, what, if any, baggage did you have going into Brooklyn 45?
I didn't have much. I wasn't familiar with the filmmaker. I hadn't, done any reading about the film ahead of time. I kind of went into it with a blank slate. The only thing I really had was a fear that ended up being nothing to worry about. When I saw the name, I worried, is this going to be some sort of spoof on Brooklyn Nine-Nine? Right? Which, if nothing else, this speaks to the importance of thinking about the title, because that's the first impression people get. Clearly, unless there's something I'm missing, it was in no way derivative of or lampooning or any way connected to the Andy Samberg comedy. But the name certainly has a certain kind of structure to it that gave me that thought initially.
Yeah, so interesting. I hadn't considered that. I didn't really have any baggage going in myself. I had not seen any of Ted Geoghegan's other films. I watched Mohawk this morning, so I'd have a point of reference, which was his previous film, if I'm not mistaken. And I'd heard his name pop up on the Movie Crypt podcast, which I used to listen to quite a bit, but I'm not really familiar with his work. I came to the film because I read, as with a lot of films we talk about on here, some positive reviews. And the one I read was Sheila O'Malley's review on the RogerEbert.com. She spoke very highly of it. And also, I really dug the poster for it. I don't know who created the poster, but it's a very old school design. And the special effects that I saw in the preview image on the Roger Ebert review, that looked very Ghostbusters, which I thought was cool. And later I learned that was intentional. They did a lot of in-camera practical effects. So yeah, I didn't have much going in either. I didn't know what to expect. Aside from knowing Larry Fessenden was in it, I'm a big fan of his work, especially as an actor. As something Geoghegan said is that, and I think I'm pronouncing your name right, Ted. If I'm wrong, I apologize. I hope you got better things to do than watch this. But if you do, and I'm getting your name wrong, let me know. But he said that Fessenden is a great actor who doesn't get enough really meaty roles to flex in. And so he wanted to write something for him that was a much more substantial role. And as we'll talk about in the Talk-to-Gon, it really worked out because I thought Fessenden was great in this. All right, so we've broken down the baggage. And as you and I both know, there's only one place men such as us can talk about these kinds of things, and that's the Talk-to-Gon.
Welcome to the Talk-to-Gon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave.
I've limbered up. My ego has recovered from the beating it took on the last episode when you reminded me of my place in the social pecking order.
Yes. Dishwasher go whoosh.
Dishwasher go whoosh. And if you want to know what the hell we're talking about, listen to the previous episode of this show over on, you can either watch it on YouTube or it's on our RSS feed. To search for Weird Together wherever you get your podcasts. That episode was Influencer. Took me a sec there, Joseph. I make a lot of podcasts, and that one kind of just slipped out of my head. Great episode, just the name completely went out of my head. Regardless, what did you think of Brooklyn 45?
Well, in general, I really enjoyed the film. You've made a references. The acting was fantastic. I thought visually it was stylized in a very cool way. There's some things I really liked that they did in the film that we'll talk about in a little bit. But overall, I thought it was one of the better films that we have reviewed for the show.
Yeah, we're on a real hot streak because we have had a couple lately that have been really, really great. I love that this felt, I mean, it was intentionally old school in that, they had the plate credits at the beginning and the end. Of course, the beginning and the end are done in Academy ratio, the sort of the
4:3.
Yeah, that's it. So obviously intentionally old style, but also old school in that it gave really talented character actors a chance to stretch their legs and to really dig into some meaty dramatic stuff that, again, I feel like it's rare to see this. Like one of the criticisms I read of the film online was that these actors are too old for these roles, which I think is so reflective of how we normally cast movies. There's Zac Efron as a 5-star general, I mean, right. no shade to Zac Efron, but we cast everything so fucking young. And in this, you've got people who are more appropriately aged, and it really felt lived in for that reason. And we'll talk more specifically about individual performances, but aside from Larry Fessenden, I really wanted to point out Jeremy Holm, who I just thought was brilliant. He played Archie. Yeah. And that guy, I don't have a screen grab, unfortunately, but that guy has the perfect face for a film set in the 40s. Like there's something about him and that sort of Clark Gable mustache thing he's got going on. He looks period perfect. I've actually seen him in other movies, specifically in Jen Wexler's The Ranger, which is a really underrated slasher. But I thought, who the fuck is that guy? Because he looks like he stepped out of 1940s film. And so I particularly appreciated that.
Yeah, I knew him from House of Cards. He had a.
Oh, okay.
There's a number of things that you kind of alluded to, and I want to go back to the aspect ratio, because I really liked the way that the film manipulated aspect ratios and black and white versus color. I think I probably watched the same interview with the director you did where he talked about that. So it opens up in black and white and that 4:3 aspect ratio, right? The old television and old film aspect ratio, which is narrower than we've all become accustomed to. And then it switches to color. And then when they enter the house and they're putting up their coats, it slowly just stretches to the 21:9 aspect ratio that we're used to in films today. And at the end of the film, it kind of does that all in reverse, right? It goes back to the 4:3. And he talked about why he did that. He wanted it to look like the old-timey film, so to speak, and he wanted the glass plate credits and that it needed to be in that 4:3 ratio to look right. And it really was a nice effect. And the reasons he did it made sense. But I think there was another effect that it had that he didn't talk about. And I don't know if this was something that was intentional for him, but for me, I thought this was really a neat effect it had sort of psychologically. It's like when you start the film and it's in the 4:3 aspect ratio and it's in black and white, it feels like you're in your living room or wherever you're watching as an outsider in the present, watching this film from the 40s or 50s, right? This old film, and you're watching as an outside observer. But when it turns from black and white to color, and then the aspect ratio stretches, it feels like you're being dropped into the room, into the present, like as though you're a time traveler, right? That you go from watching this as someone who's watching a Turner Classic Movies to you've somehow been transported into it is now a present experience because you're viewing it in color and the aspect ratios that we are accustomed to. So something about the familiarity. And to me, it feels like it pulls you into the film in a really interesting way. And then in reverse, it kind of helps you out to exit the film. And then you're watching the credits on your television in your living room on Turner Classic Movies again. Even if that wasn't his intent, I thought that just as a viewer experience was a really kind of neat way to watch this film based on those things that were manipulated.
Yeah, I agree completely. And something else that occurred to me is you could liken it almost as a metaphor for memory.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we're looking back on the past, our brains naturally are wired to forget the bad stuff. That's why people romanticize the past so much. Oh, things were so much better when I was a kid. That they weren't. They categorically were not. The past was garbage. Aside from being able to, afford groceries, which, hey, that was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from that, a lot of the past was shit.
Yeah.
And this is actually something Geoghegan has even talked about in interviews, saying that, one of the reasons he set the film when he did is he wants to highlight the fact that, the post-war era wasn't great. Rin says, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had an aspect ratio and a black and white to color change in one of the early scenes. Interesting. Yeah, I still have never seen that.
Me neither.
But yeah, so I think that it sort of serves as a great visual metaphor. When we're in the past, when we're in the moment, where you experience it, and you have the fullness of that experience. But when you're looking back on it, you get that again, everything's kind of blinkered, and you focus on the important stuff, the stuff that's. Although by the end of the film, there's not a lot of good stuff. I mean, by the end of the film, a lot of ghosts are some of them are laid to rest. Skeletons are dug out of closets. The relationships are irrevocably changed.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I've talked about this before, that we always, I shouldn't say always, we often look back on the past with kind of more favorable views, because also as we get older, when we were younger, we felt better usually. Our bodies hurt less. We weren't being crushed by the pressures and responsibilities of the world when we were kids. Now, some people's childhood are very traumatic, so I don't want to make light of that. Not everyone has that. But generally speaking, though, there's a tendency to view the past as better than it was at an individual level. I know sociologically there's a whole issue of social class and race and differential experiences of the past, and that the past was better for people who look like me than people who don't look like me in North America in particular. And that's one kind of macro level aspect of it. But even individually, as our health and our bodies kind of break down, we look back on the past as the time where we felt more vital. So yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I want to kind of mention here, that Derek brought this up, and this was kind of something that I had in my notes. He said it very much had the feel of a stage play. And again, we probably watched the same interview. The director described it as a real-time chamber drama. I watched the interview after watching the film, and before ever seeing that, I also had kind of my notes that it felt like a play, right? And clearly
Very
that
much
was
so.
intentional, right? It's a one-room set aside from the opening and closing, right? And the set feels like a play in terms of the color and how it's staged in a good way. Like it looks like a really, a stage production set that was put together with a lot of attention to detail and choosing color palettes and items and artifacts to give a certain feeling. It's a little surreal. It's a little, exaggerated reality, but it's really nicely done in terms of the set. The acting and dialogue where, it just felt like you kind of went around the room from one little dyad to another dyad, right? And conversations. And even the end credits, listing the cast as the players, right? So in general, it really did feel like a kind of a play brought to the big screen, so to speak.
Yeah, and I've read in interviews with Christina, again, I think it's Klebe, that they had a fair amount of rehearsal time, which is not common for film at this level anymore. From what I understand, it's not uncommon for actors to basically turn up on the day they have to shoot, and that's the first time meeting the rest of the cast. I've heard on podcasts stories of actors doing their auditions over Zoom, getting to wherever it is they're shooting, and just go. There's no time to find a rhythm. There's no time. You're supposed to be lifelong friends. You're just meeting now. And so they have the advantage of rehearsal, and it shows. Again, there's a sense of camaraderie. There's a sense of mood. There's a sense that these people know each other. What I said about the character of Marla, who is, during the war, she was an interrogator. She was essentially a torturer. Mm-hmm. And she turns up with Bob, and Bob is a government clerk. He has no experience of war. And they really effectively show that feeling I was talking about, where you walk into a party where you don't know anyone and you don't get any of the inside jokes. Mm-hmm. And again, that's only something you can do if you can establish the group dynamic. So yeah, again, I think using character actors allows you to do that, using people who are, I think actually the actor who plays Bob, Ron Raines, I think he is a stage veteran, and I assume the others have probably done stage as well. So the quality of the script and the quality of the actors, I think, allows for that shorthand.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the director also said that when they filmed it, they kind of went chronologically in the story. They kind of filmed it through instead of jumping around.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
So for the actors, it probably felt very much like a play, right? Performing it kind of straight through. So I think that also, in the interview, he talked about how that allowed, instead of dropping in at a scene an hour and a half in and having to, remember, how do I feel at this point in the experience, you've been working your way through the story and building yourself up to where your character is at that point in the evening and how they're feeling. And I think, the cast was outstanding. And I think the acting and the quality of the acting is first and foremost attributable to their talents. But I think that the way the film was done in terms of production, I think also made it a lot easier for them, or enabled them, to really do their best for some of those reasons. So, but yeah, I mean, Anne Ramsey, who played Marla Sheridan, she was, to me, her performance stood out. They were great performances across the board, but she was fantastic in that role.
And for those of you who haven't seen it, she is also in Taking of Deborah Logan. Yeah, that's it. The Taking of Deborah Logan, which is, I think, a film that at the time didn't really get the attention it deserved, but has grown a cult following in the years since its release. And it's a very good horror film. And she's also excellent in that. And I agree. She's brilliant. I mean, especially later, when we discover that Hawk, played by Larry Fessenden, has called his friends to his house because his wife last year committed suicide. And he wants to have a seance because he cannot handle the notion that she is gone. He wants them to participate in this with him. And later, again, folks, we spoil the shit out of these movies, although you should still watch them. Actually, there's a great podcast. It's not made anymore, but I think the archives are still online. It's called Switchblade Sisters. It was produced by the writer April Wolf, I think is her name. I feel bad. I'm not totally sure on her name. She's very funny, and her podcast was exceptional. Switchblade Sisters. But one of the things she said is it's not basically the spoilers don't matter, because it's not what happens in a film, it's the experience that matters.
Yeah.
So like this should not ruin your experience of the film, and I agree. So we're going to spoil the shit out of this, but still watch it. But at the end of the first act, Hawk kills himself, and you find out that his wife killed herself because she thought the Germans living down the street were spies. No one would listen to her, so she killed herself. And you find out that Hawk actually has her tied up in the closet, the German girl that his wife thought was a spy. And I've completely lost track of why I'm telling this, Joseph. I'll be honest with you. I was distracted by
Anne Ramsey and what a great actor she is. You talked
right. Okay. Yeah. So later she decides she's forced by Paul, one of their friends, that sort of the military man of the film. She's forced by him to torture Hildy, the German girl, to see if she is in fact a Nazi. And it's her resignation in that scene, but her also toughness. Like you see the person she was. You see the torturer that she was before, this interrogator that she was before, and she just slips into it so effortlessly. It was really cool to watch.
Saying Anne Ramsey's the mom and throw. Yeah, the two actors with similar names. This Anne Ramsey is Ramsay in the Brooklyn 45. Anne Ramsey is also from Goonies.
Oh, of course, yeah, Mama Fratelli.
Yeah. But she was also in Mad About You. She was also in A League of Their Own.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. Total aside, I'm not convinced that Hildy was innocent.
So that's interesting because they never come down on it in the film. The actress has said in interviews she believes that Hildy was not a Nazi.
Here's my two pieces, okay? When the ghost comes out and it's like having her reenacting the knife with like having Hildy cut her wrist. Maybe the ghost of his wife was doing that just to set her up and get her killed because she was committed to this idea. But part of me wonders if that's really what happened. And repeatedly when Hildy was asked, have you ever been part of, and she always was kind of slow to answer that. So I don't know. Listen, I know it's not nearly as important as the other themes that are more salient in this film. But as an aside, I don't know.
No, that's fair. There was a moment where even I myself thought that, because when she's asked the name of her daughters under interrogation, she hesitates a moment. And, but I thought about it. And one of the things that's kind of fascinating about the film, and again, I don't know what Ted Geoghegan's experience with this subject is, but one of the things, of course, my day job is making the Ghost Story Guys, and we talk about paranormal shit all the time. Mm-hmm. And regardless of where you fall on that continuum of belief, whether you think it's all hooey or not, one of the constants in the lore, your position on it is irrelevant, is what I'm saying. The lore is what's important to this. And in the lore, it's said that it doesn't matter what they say they are. If you are contacting something else, there's no guarantee it's going to be the people you want it to be. We have this notion that
that's true.
You reach out and it's like ordering a burger at McDonald's. You're going to get exactly what you asked for. But in actual fact, the lore suggests that it can be anything, and they're going to tell you things, but they're not going to tell you the truth. And I thought that basically, if we're seeing Susie, if we're really seeing Hawk's wife, we're seeing the fact that this woman has never moved on. Mm-hmm. Has, because one of the notions of mainstream paranormal lore that I'm not crazy about is that once you die, everything's happy and you're ethereal, and if there's any parity between the afterlife and the real life, I think it's that people are probably still shitty. That people can still hang on to things. It's your choice whether or not you're going to let things go. And so I didn't necessarily, and also there was so much sinister shit happening, especially when Hawk's corpse animates and starts smashing its head into the table in truly gruesome fashion, with some great effects work, I might add. I really felt like this is an indication that not all is as it seems, because Hawk was upset, but for him to mutilate himself that way, that doesn't make sense based on what we know of the person. This seems like something that has been given entry into our world and just delights in turning us against each other.
Yeah. Aside, I just remember during the seance, the phrase that, and I put this in my notes because it stood out to me, that Hawk used, saying when he was inviting the spirits, was force your way into our world with all of your might. Yeah. That seemed like a bad idea.
That's it. Again, if you believe that shit works, and that there's a lot of shit out there to be calling. Mm-hmm. And so who knows what's going to be picking up the phone.
I will say I did enjoy the references and influence from the spiritualism movement. About 11 minutes in, there was sort of an indirect reference to the Society for Psychical Research. They referenced that there was a society in England, right, that studies this stuff, so it's, the SPR. The general reference and attitudes towards parlor tricks, I think, was felt accurate, because, people who aren't familiar with this or haven't read about this, the whole spiritualism movement, a lot of the people who rejected that, and I think there's good reasons to be cynical and critical about it. Skeptical is probably the right word. People who were skeptical about that really kind of pointed towards all the kind of the wrapping on the doors and all the kind of the cheap parlor tricks. So it felt like the attitudes of the characters about that seance felt time appropriate. Yeah, like people would have had that sort of disposition towards seances and, kind of coming out, being maybe decades after the spiritualism movement kind of had waned some. And, the whole ectoplasm thing about 25 minutes in, was kind of an interesting reference. So I appreciated all those connections to that without spelling it out too directly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like too that the drama in the film was human.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I think that some paranormally themed films get wrong, is they think all of the focus should be on the paranormal thing, when I think the human element is the most important thing. And honestly, I feel, again, I make my living telling ghost stories, and I still think that's the most important thing. I was invited to talk at a high school a few years back, just before the pandemic. And obviously I talked about being a writer. I talked about, the podcast wasn't as popular then as it is now, but I still talked about podcasting. But my takeaway, and I think this is one of the reasons that, some folks don't take to my show, is that I say that whether or not anything happens after you die is kind of irrelevant, because what matters is here, and what matters is people, and what matters is the way you live your life. So, I mean, sure, ghost stories are cool, but it doesn't really affect you most of the time. You should just live your life thinking about what's here and what's now. Live your life like there's nothing afterwards, which does not mean be crazy, because I know some really religious people think, oh, if there's no God, you're going to be an asshole, which I think says more about them than they realize. But no, you live your life on the basis of what's here. And I think if you're writing good horror, the characters are what matter. I just saw The Flash, which I liked more than a lot of people. And the director, Andy Muschietti, the first film of his I saw was Mama. And it was terrifying because it worked on an emotional level as well as a horror level. And again, that's why I think Brooklyn 45 works the way it does, because you care about the relationships, you feel the relationships, and the focus is on the human drama, because ultimately it's humans who do the murdering. I mean, the ghosts can suggest and lie and whatever, but I mean, who knows that they're telling the truth? You know, what they're telling you is going to be, you're going to receive it based on what you want to hear.
No, I think that's a great and important point. And I want to kind of use that as a way to segue into what I think were some of the relational and the human parts of this film that were, to me, more important and more, in some ways, more interesting than the paranormal side of things in the film. For me, there were 4 kind of major themes that stood out. I'll just kind of throw them out there, and then we can kind of talk about them a bit. The first one was sort of this nationalism and xenophobia, and the history is well documented, how we've treated Japanese persons in the internments and all that, and so on and so forth, right? There certainly was some kind of topics related to sexuality and toxic masculinity, and where things were with the LGBTQ community at that point in history, grief and PTSD, obviously. And a topic I'll want to get into is kind of this complicated nature of evil, right? Kind of war and obedience to authority. So maybe the first one I want to talk about is that the whole kind of sexuality and toxic masculinity thing, because what was really interesting was the relationship between, Major Archibald and Major DeFranco, right? Because there was sort of this ribbing back and forth about, Archibald's kind of closeted sort of, sexuality, which at that time, historically, even more so, you had to be careful about that. And there was some interesting kind of dynamics there. And I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
They made reference to him being homosexual. Paul, I think, was the commanding officer. or the person above him. And he made what seemed to be pretty callous jokes, but also seemed to leave it there. And it was like just an acknowledged thing between them. But, you know, in a way, it's sort of that thing where I've seen this in personal relationships where if you are gay, in a way, you have to roll with the punch. You can, I mean, a lot of guys I know who were gay or who are gay, not were gay, they are gay. You know, they're cool with it. They'll roll with the jokes, but at the same time, they shouldn't have to. You know, They become really good at rolling with the jokes. But when you actually step back from it, you realize, yeah, it's hard when the room is kind of laughing, and you have to be cool with it. Otherwise, you're going to be the bummer. You're going to be that guy, and that sucks because that's not something you should have to do. But I've definitely seen that, and that felt like what was happening here. Because the other thing I noticed is, as soon as things went south, and Archie was no longer being the person that Paul needed him to be, he immediately went to the homophobic slurs. It was no longer, because they used the word fruit, and obviously that was a derogatory term for a person who was gay. And Archie kind of rolls with it, and it's done in a joking way. But yeah, when the chips are down and Paul's mad, it's not a joke anymore.
Right.
And if the only difference between what you say to someone being a joke and being a slur is the mood in which you say it, then it was always a slur.
Right.
And so again, I think, yeah, ultimately the attitudes are revealed. He's not okay with this. You know, some people, Marla doesn't care, but Paul cares deeply. And a part of that, obviously, he's presented as a very masculine character. Yeah. Ezra Buzzington, who plays Paul, also played a similar role in Mohawk. He was the chief villain there. And it was interesting because his character in Mohawk was perhaps vastly more evil than Paul was. But he actually got to have a more human moment, I felt, in Mohawk. There's this moment where his son is killed in front of him, and he's washing his son's blood off himself, and he finds a piece of his son's hair with some gore attached to it. And he has this incredibly tender moment of heartbreak, but it's very quick, but very, 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 very much felt. And I kind of felt in this, he was a little bit more of a boilerplate villain. Like there were almost times where I thought, okay, the movie should probably be over, but Paul won't let them out of the room just because, no, the movie's not over yet.
No, that makes sense.
But yeah, I definitely felt like that they were okay with it until they weren't okay with it when it ceased to be convenient for them.
Yeah, like the first time that sort of conversation kind of goes in a direction, it was like this banter. They kind of create this falsely tense moment, and he's saying these slurs. Paul's saying these slurs, and Archie's kind of acting kind of serious about it. And then he just breaks the tension, and it's like, oh, they've done this dance before, right? And it's not something that someone should have to endure, or you shouldn't have to have that kind of reaction, obviously. But in that time, it was a different time, and that's kind of, again, it's not. There's a lot of problems still in terms of how those populations are treated, but he kind of had to do that. But like you say, when shit got real, it was no longer just banter. The thing I really want to talk about with this in particular was that the whole thing about the complicated nature of evil, because one of the things that's revealed is, Archie's character is going to be sort of on trial for war crimes, and they don't really talk about what it is initially, but then they later in the film reveal what happened, and that under the orders that were kind of sent down through the chain of command that included Paul and Hawk. He threw grenades into a building with a bunch of children, basically, and killed them. And it's obviously it's horrific. And there's a lot of conversation in the film about, is he evil? And he's even wrestling with that. And ironically, there's a point where, the only person who's saying he's not evil is Hildy, the woman who would maybe have all the reason to hate him the most, which was certainly interesting. But they talk about this conversation about evil. And for me, it reminded me of some famous studies, experiments that have been done that kind of explored this. And, you may be familiar with this, you may not be. But Stanley Milgram's experiments, he was a psychologist who, in I believe is the early 1960s, did some experiments in obedience and what they did is they had people come into a lab, and they had one person who was the participant and a second person who was actually part of the study acting, but the participant didn't realize that the person was in league. And one person would be set up as a teacher, the other as a learner, so to speak, and they had to answer certain questions, matching words. And the person who was actually not in the know, the participant, thought that they were administering shocks to the other person if they got them wrong. The shocks would be an increasing magnitude and to a point that could potentially be deadly. Now, the whole thing about this is the person who actually was on the other side was part of the study, was not actually being shocked, but as they hit the switch to administer what they thought was a shock, they had recordings of the person reacting, and the whole point of this was to see if a person under a direction of authority over an authority figure would do horrible things. And, the people who were part of the study were led to believe that they were just doing a psychological study about learning. And the results were about 2/3 of people continued administering shocks all the way to the highest level when they were told to keep doing that, right? When they were told, no, we need you to continue to do this. We will be responsible for it. Yeah, Rin saying that study was so awful, so many people following orders. And listen, I teach sociology, I teach research methods, and I will tell you, in academic circles, this study is cited more often about the ethics of the study than the actual findings. Like certainly what it tells us about people is scary. When you teach research methods, you often talk about how a study like that would not get approved by an institutional review board today. You couldn't do a study like that today. But Milgram was inspired by when you look at kind of what had happened in Nazi Germany, were all the people who were part of that truly evil to the core, or structurally, contextually, do people in certain contexts do horrible things, right? And it's a complicated topic and answer, but certainly this film reminded me. And then there's one other study I'll mention, the Stanford prison experiment. You've probably heard of that. Philip Zimbardo in 1971. Had a number of students who were playing either prison guards or prisoners. It was supposed to be a 2-week study. They ended it after 6 days because the behavior and the treatment was getting worse and worse, and people were internalizing it. And they talk about the power of the situation. Now, it doesn't hurt that, or it doesn't help that, he looks a little bit like Ming the Merciless, Philip Zimbardo does. But what all these studies kind of talk about, and what to me kind of I take away from it, is there is a complicated question and conversation about evil. Like, there's a socially desirable thing where we're supposed to just say some, things that are reprehensible to us. Oh, well, everyone involved must be evil, right? And if you don't say that, then you must be a shit person. But it's complicated this is not to take the responsibility off people, but when people are in structures where they have authority structures that tell them to do things, and they're expected to fill a role, and everything around them is in concert with that and reinforces that, there are structural incentives where there are evil structures that make people who are complicated humans do evil things. And so this is an underlying theme that the film kind of touches on. And to me, it's a fascinating subject that they kind of broached in the film. So what are your thoughts on all that, Brent?
Well, no, you're right. I mean, I was raised Catholic. It didn't take, obviously, but I was raised Catholic. And so I very much have this idea of absolution in my head, of what it takes to be absolved of your sins, of the things you have done wrong. And I was thinking about this in relation to the film. I used to play softball with this guy. He was a soldier. He was a former British soldier. He had fought in Afghanistan. I think he'd done at least 1, 2, or possibly 2. And I don't know that he killed people, but I'm guessing. And certainly I knew he had been present at the site of murders. And there were some other pretty awful things I'd heard, just things that soldiers do, not exactly violence, but gross things all the same. And it was interesting because he was a lot of fun. He was a fun guy to hang around. He was a fun guy to play ball with. He was kind of a tool, but he could be fun. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was interesting how easily I accepted his presence, despite knowing this is a combat veteran. And regardless of, right or wrong, he has taken, I'm fairly certain he had taken at least one life. but you fold it into that image of a person, right? Because it's not happening in front of you. And what's interesting is what it actually took for me to be put off that guy was not the idea that he had maybe killed someone, but it was actually when I found out he was a racist. I found that out later, and that was enough to be like, okay, no, we're done here. And I wonder if it's a difference between seeing something happen in front of you and sort of not being present for the other things, kind of hearing it third party. But anyways, setting that aside, I wonder that myself. I wonder, what do you do if you love someone who's done bad things? How do you square that? How do you reconcile that? And I think it's a part of us that we don't question enough, because you're right. I think we like to externalize evil. We like to think, oh, well, if someone's a monster, I'll know because that's a monster. I remember the film Jojo Rabbit caught a lot of shit because there were some Nazis in there who were funny, and they were, otherwise likable people aside from the fact they were Nazis. And the film was really lambasted for this because they said, well, that's bullshit. Nazis are evil. Well, yeah, but also they were people. And you need to be able to identify this, because if you think, like, if for me, even that soldier, again, I don't know that he'd kill people. I have a suspicion, but I don't know. But if he had, I'm chumming around with him playing softball. But if I was one of the Afghani villagers who'd been affected by his violence, they'd look at me and go, what are you doing, man? This guy's a monster. And it sort of puts the lie. I used to hang out with this guy, and he once told me he was hanging out with some other really sketchy people. And I said, they're kind of dicks, man. He goes, yeah, but they're nice to me. Well, that's a bullshit excuse. They're nice to me. And I recognize that's nonsense. We need to recognize people can be more than one thing, but we also then have to weigh those things in the balance and determine how comfortable we are with one or the other. Because, again, like, okay, I knew a guy I used to hang out with. Actually, funny enough, I just watched this documentary called Kings of Coke about the West End gang of Montreal. And Montreal in, I think this was the 70s, was like a haven for bank robbers. The place was just Christmas. Banks were getting robbed all over the place. And it reminded me that I used to, when I was working at Radio Shack back in Revelstoke, this guy used to come in and borrow money from me. And he was the next bank robber. I forgot about it. I just remembered his name was Doc, and he had done time in Montreal for being a getaway driver for a bank robbery. And I just, at the time, I didn't think about it because you don't really have as much of a moral sense when you're younger. But as I'm older now, I realize you got to weigh, okay, so he was funny and he was fun. And again, he would come and borrow $10 from me every now and again. But if he did that, then he was also participating in violence. I have to try and figure out which is weighted more to me. But we have to be able to hold those two opposing ideas in our head. Like, this they've done evil shit. And okay, so how much access do I give them? How close do I let them in? And I think we're not at a place where we can do that, because I think we have these really simplified ideas like, oh, they've done bad, so they're out.
Yeah.
Or, but I don't think we've entertained sort of that gray area. And like Archie was a very, taking it back to the film, he's a very classy guy, very fun guy, very funny guy, but also he killed a bunch of kids.
It's tough because it cuts a lot of different ways, because on one level, if you humanize a person who has done horrible things, then that becomes a socially undesirable thing. Like, someone say you're making excuses for them, or how could you, and it gets complicated, because then you're like, well, where do you draw that line? Right. And we as a society have to make those decisions. And it's part of the reason we have laws and judicial systems and processes to do that. But it does become difficult and complex to kind of do that calculus, so to speak. So, it's definitely an interesting conversation, and there's a lot of layers to it for sure.
Yeah. I wanted to jump to the xenophobia thing, because obviously the film hinges on the fact that Hildy is German, and therefore she's immediately worthy of suspicion because she has a German accent. Mm-hmm. But something that came up during an interview with the actress who plays Hildy, again, Christina Klebe, she did some historical research in preparing for the role. And one of the things she was shocked by was the existence of the German-American Bund, which, of course, was a Nazi organization that flourished in wartime America, culminating, you could say, in a rally in Madison Square Garden, I want to say 1939, which was attended by some 20,000 people. 20,000 Nazi sympathizers in New York City, openly celebrating their allegiance to this foreign power, which was mowing its way through Europe. And I guarantee not all 20,000 of those people had German accents.
Yeah.
And something, if you look even at a cursory reading of history following the post-war, following the Second World War, big business didn't really care who was a Nazi and who wasn't. It was all about who was useful. And again, it's the enemy is among you, and trying to separate them by, well, they sound like this, they look like this, that's bullshit. Like, obviously, we're in a situation now where we're overrun with goddamn Nazis again, and we're still on the lookout for the other guy. If a Muslim guy shoots up a school or shoots up a something, well, that's terrorism. But if a European person does it, well, there's a problem with their mental health. We don't even use the word terrorism, and it absolutely is terrorism. And I think the fact that we're losing that history. We're not teaching people. The fact that someone who was essentially a second generation immigrant, Christina Klebb, didn't know this. This wasn't taught in schools. That's scary.
It's interesting because we look at history today, right? Contemporarily, we look back and we see the evils of history, whether it be what happened with the Nazis, or we look at the complicated history of race in the United States and the civil rights movement. And we watch these old grainy films and we're like, we see the people who are the backlash against the civil rights movement. We're like, how could anyone be so, racist? And how could they not support equal rights? And how could they not support the civil rights movement? Something that today, we laud as an important counterculture movement that led to social change. And then you fast forward today and you see contemporary backlashes against what's going on. And, I teach sociology, so that's an area we get into, and we look at it and you see, there's a whole culture war today of, if it's a book that teaches that racism is a thing, there's school districts that want it out of their libraries. I mean, this is going on.
I find that terrifying.
Oh yeah,
genuinely frightening.
There's legislation that has been passed in a lot of states, including the state I reside, that is trying to limit divisive concepts or topics from being taught in schools, which is basically, they don't want you to teach about racism being a thing. And we see all the things that are going on, and today that are the people who support those things are just justifying them in whatever way they can or do. And then you look at it as a thoughtful observer, you're like, I see exactly how people were on the wrong side 40, 50 years ago, because there are people on the wrong side today who defiantly deny that they're on the wrong side. Anyway, I know this is getting a little kind of off the rails, but yeah, I mean, the whole kind of nationalism, xenophobia, it's kind of always there in one form or another, unfortunately, it seems.
And in the case of the film, to bring it back to Brooklyn 45, because we're going to have to wrap it up here, it forces your soul out of shape. Mm-hmm. It bends you into things you were never meant to be, because the xenophobia and the fear in this film originally forced the Marla character she was a torturer. She tortured people, I'm sure some of whom were innocent. And in this film, it forces her to torture a woman who she believes genuinely to be innocent. And, if this person who has a history of torturing the truth out of people believes this person is telling them the truth, then, we are sort of, I would say, can accept it at face value. So that fear, that xenophobia, forced this group of otherwise normal people, in battle scarred, of course, but to torture. And then the one innocent in the group, Bob, he commits double homicide.
Yeah.
And disgusts even the hardened torturer of the group to the point where she no longer wishes to be touched by him. And again, that's ultimately what these things do. It distorts our soul. I don't know that I necessarily believe in the soul, but I think the metaphor is useful. It forces us into terrifying shapes and horrible shapes and unrecognizable shapes. And it's, again, that we're trying to ignore those things because it's easier to do that is genuinely frightening.
Yeah. No, I agree. Makes a lot of sense.
All right, Joseph, we have to wind it up. We like to keep this thing at about an hour. Of course, if you're listening to the audio version, this might be a little bit shorter. It's because I tend to trim them down. Big thanks to everyone who joined us for the live stream. Before we do that, though, of course, Joseph, wind up just would recommend Brooklyn 45?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the more enjoyable films I think we've watched.
Agreed. Yeah. It is streaming on Shudder. It's a Shudder original right now. You can get Shudder for something like $5 or $6 a month. I'm sure you can get a week free if you sign up for the trial. Do not pirate independent films. We see that all the time on this show. Every dollar you spend on independent films is another vote for more independent films. You pirate this shit, no one's going to make it. If you're going to pirate things, which we don't recommend you do, pirate things like Marvel. Disney can afford it, although maybe not Warner Brothers so much. They keep making bombs. But yeah, don't pirate independent films. Check out Brooklyn 45 on Shudder. And one film I wanted to give a quick boost to, we won't do the whole sting because we're short on time. It's a revenge film called The Wrath of Becky. It is a sequel to the film Becky, starring Lulu Wilson. If you've seen Becky, you'll know it's a revenge film about a young woman whose parents are murdered in front of her by neo-Nazis. I guess thematically ties to this film. She goes on a bloody rampage to get revenge. Wrath of Becky follows a similar template and sets up future films, which I generally hope they make because I like Lulu Wilson, I like Becky, and I like seeing Nazis get murdered, Joseph. I'll be honest with you.
Hey,
it makes my heart sing. All right, my friend, where can everyone find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at JoKomo13, JOKOMO13, and on YouTube at The Cardinal Rule if you happen to be into NFL football. I do my thing over there.
Perfect. I'm Largely the Truth on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can find my other podcast, The Ghost Story Guys, everywhere. Find podcasts live or at ghoststoryguys.com. All the music on this show was composed and performed by Elliot Wilder, performing as The Revenants. Find more from Elliot at therevenants1.bandcamp.com or on streaming platforms everywhere, courtesy of Night Harvest Recordings, which is the Ghost Story Guys house label. Our theme song is, what is it, Joseph? Yeah, it's Rest in Peace by The Revenants from the album Music from Big Beige. And again, you'll find that streaming everywhere you get your tunes. And again, thank you so much for joining us, folks. Again, for those of you who are joining us live, and for those of you who've been finding the show afterwards, again, our numbers are going up week after week, month after month. We were charting in 2 different charts in Ireland recently, Joseph. I don't know if you saw that in the email.
I did see that.
Yeah, world domination, but not the kind we've been talking about.
Right.
The good kind. The good kind. And yeah, so thank you, Rin. Thank you, Derek. Again, we really, really appreciate you guys being here. And I don't know what we're doing next time, but we will be back with an audio episode. I guess I don't even know how long after this. I think it'll be out. This will come out a week after this airs. And then so in 3 weeks, we'll have an audio episode. Then next month's live stream. We'd love to see you there. And until then, remember, we're weird.
And you're weird.
So why not be weird together?
Let me ride.